If you're inside the Cardano ecosystem, it's hard not to notice the huge information asymmetry around the nature of Cardano. Due to the legacy of anit-Hoskinsonism perpetually emitted by the Ethereum world, there were a lot of crypto people looking for any reason to discredit Cardano in the last bull run. And of course, they were happy to use their own metrics of success to do so. Where was Cardano's total value locked? Where were the giant DeFi protocols? How come transaction fees paid to validators weren't a king's ransom? The answers to these questions had always justified the obvious fundamental flaws in the EVM universe. Cardano seemed like it wasn't even trying, and they were right. 2021, 2022, even 2023. We're talking about practice, man. These are scrimmage years for us. This is preseason training. We're in the gym with the kettlebells and the plates and getting our cardio in. We're preparing for the real game that comes next. And it won't be measured in TVL or fees paid. It'll be measured in real world adoption. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss where I think crypto is going over the next couple of years and why I think Cardano has been perfectly positioning itself for this for years. We'll discuss the release of the 2022 Essential Cardano Guide, Binance.us releasing a Cardano article today, Charles once again making a good point about sidechains and computation in Cardano, Ben Goertzel with an interesting observation about OpenAI, and reports of multiple additional alleged ties between Gensler and FTX. If you agree with me that once again the AI-generated thumbnail probably perfectly represents the athleticism of the average Cardano community member, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. This is probably going to be the last regular Cardano Rumor Rundown video on this channel in 2022. So there may be a live stream or something like that, but we'll see if I can free up the time for it. But this will be the last regular video. So let's talk about what I think is going to happen over the next few years in crypto. And I could be completely wrong. I am often wrong about everything. So I could be completely wrong. So this is not advice of any kind. You should base no decisions on this. I'm just talking about what I think might happen. And it's been the same thing that I thought might happen since I first got into Cardano, since I first saw that Charles whiteboard video. And I'm going to put it in the context of what's already happened in crypto, because all of crypto is still inextricably tied to the Bitcoin halvening cycle, the halvening cycle, however you'd like to pronounce it. That cycle where the Bitcoin block reward gets cut in half. We're still, all of crypto, very much tied to that cycle. And what we've seen with that cycle has been transformation. Every single cycle, it's been like transformation. Maybe not as markedly in the early cycles, but very much so in the last few. So going way back to that 2012, 2013 period, I heard about Bitcoin, got into Bitcoin, and eventually, immediately I was hypnotized by the potential of this alternate monetary system that was capped, where there was no central bank that could inflate the currency, devaluing the amounts of that currency I was currently holding. That's a very seductive narrative. And I think it was for everybody back then. And the primary narrative that I think was attracting all of us was that this alternate monetary system that was better for the people, less manipulable by the central banks. I think that's why all of us were getting in at that time. If I remember right, I didn't actually buy my first Bitcoin until after the Mt. Gox crash. Even back in those early days, it was super obvious that Bitcoin was on some kind of crazy parabolic thing, and we were going to see the back half of that curve. And sure enough, we did. So I waited. Thank goodness I waited. I can say that now. I mean, now it wouldn't have mattered, but at the time I was very happy I waited. But I waited until after the Mt. Gox crash to buy my first Bitcoin, and pretty soon I was even accepting Bitcoin in a brick and mortar business. We were using it as money, and that was a big part of the narrative then. Then we had the big block size civil war, the big battle between the big blockers and the small blockers. And because I liked using Bitcoin as money in a business that I owned, I was definitely on the big blocker side. We won't get into all the vagaries of that whole debate right now. It's no longer important. The small blockers definitely won that debate. At that time, though, I would say almost all of the attention in crypto was just on these base layer cryptocurrencies. You had things like Bitcoin and Litecoin and eventually Doge. And no people were talking about colored coins and eventually this idea of smart contracts. And I know there are predecessor notions of those things that go way back, but largely in mainstream crypto, people were just talking about the base layer cryptocurrencies, and we were using them as money. After the block size wars, there was this transformation, and all of a sudden, the hodling and store of value narratives took root. That was sort of the next big thing. No longer were we going to be buying coffee with Bitcoin. It was a store of value. It was still protection against the inflationary measures of central banks globally, but that whole buying coffee with Bitcoin thing, that went out the window with the block size wars. Then we saw this rise of Ethereum. Ethereum came along. I bought some Ethereum shortly after the ICO. I didn't buy in the ICO, but I bought Ethereum shortly after the ICO at a very, very low price. I want to say it was like 72 cents or something like that. And the promise became something new at that point. You already know what that is. It was programmability. The whole notion of crypto was transformed by the addition of programmability that Ethereum brought. So at that point, we'd already undergone a couple of transformations. We went from just having Bitcoin to having Bitcoin plus altcoins with the addition of Litecoin and every other coin that came along. And then all of a sudden we added programmability. So we'd already had a couple of transformations, just Bitcoin to altcoins to going from, using the coins just as money to this whole hodling store of value narrative. And then all of a sudden we had programmability on top of that. Of course, the programmability led to ICOs, and that was the big story in that whole 2017 cycle. Every single coin had this public and open ICO, and it seemed like that was normal. That was completely normalized. Classically, EOS did $4 billion ICO, and everybody kept telling me how somehow ICOs were perfectly normal and legal. They'd been completely normalized within crypto, and everybody was telling me about how ICOs were going to continue to be a normal thing in crypto, and people would just keep doing ICOs forever. You already know that crypto's ICO character arc definitively ended after that cycle. I would peg it at the moment it was clear that EOS was going to get into big trouble for their $4 billion, seemingly never ending ICO. As soon as EOS had to settle with the feds, it was pretty clear that ICOs were largely going to be over. We weren't going to have another cycle where every single coin was just doing an ICO, getting all this money up front, and then, theoretically building something. Some of them built something, some of them did not. It was clear that was going to be over. So we saw another transformation. We went through this ICO cycle, and then that ended. And then we come to this most recent cycle where we had DeFi and NFTs. And now that cycle is kind of playing out. And you notice with each of these cycles, at least the recent ones, in the early cycles, might have been a little different. But in the recent cycles, it's largely been this transfer of assets from retail to the developers and founders of these projects. ICOs, what was happening? Retail was buying fungible tokens from the projects, which ended up lining the pockets of the developers and the founders and the other people running the projects. With DeFi, what do we have largely? Same thing. Retail shoves money into these DeFi projects, and it largely ends up lining the pockets of the people running the project. NFTs, same thing. Transfer of assets from retail to the people running the projects. Admittedly, there have surely been some members of retail in each of those scenarios who happened to time things correctly and made a bunch of money. We've all seen the stories. That's what drives all the new people right into crypto every time we have a bull cycle, because they hear those stories from the last bull cycle or the recent ones from the current bull cycle, and they get in because they want to be that person who times things perfectly, makes a bunch of money. And that certainly does happen. But for most people in retail, they come into crypto, they buy something from some project, and they don't end up making a ton of money. The people who end up making a ton of money, not always, but in a lot of cases, are the people running the project. What we've seen is every time this happens, we've seen regulators come in and do something about it. This is what happened with ICOs. There was a huge transfer of assets from retail to people selling fungible tokens back in the 2017 cycle. And afterwards, too many people lost too much money, complaints to federal regulators, and the SEC comes in and says, hey, these are securities offerings. You guys are all doing illegal stuff. And then that ends. I think the same thing will largely happen in this cycle. There will be and have already been many complaints to federal regulators about loss of money and things like DeFi projects and even NFT projects. Although I think NFT projects are slightly different just because of some of the art issues that that were touched on in one of the articles I included yesterday in the written version of the Cardano Rumor Rundown. But we're probably going to see a lot of the same things. And we'll come out of the cycle and there will be a more restrictive environment for crypto once again. What does crypto do every single time it finds itself being restricted? Crypto is one of the most creative spaces in all of modern commercial activities because crypto reinvents itself every single time. It rises like the phoenix out of the ashes and finds a new way for people to build projects so they can transfer assets from retail to themselves as project founders. And some of those projects survive. Some of them actually do something and they survive past a single cycle. But a lot of them just kind of do their thing, get the money from retail, and disappear, maybe to reemerge in a different project, something like that. Crypto always reinvents itself. I think the difference this time is that crypto, and we'll do that again, we'll find new project founders will find new ways to get retail to give them their money. That'll happen again in some way. We'll reinvent some new way for that to happen. But the difference this time is that crypto has gotten a lot bigger. Crypto is known to all the policymakers in Washington. They may not understand how it works, but they all know about crypto and they all know they have to do something about crypto. It got too big this time. Sam Bankman-Fried, Caroline and company, they made too many headlines. Everybody in Washington knows about crypto. All the policymakers in the EU know about crypto. All the policymakers in every developed modern country knows about crypto. They're going to squeeze things a lot harder this time, and crypto might actually have to do something it hasn't really had to do since those early cycles, and that's provide real world utility. Like I said, back in the early days of crypto, Bitcoin was a great new form of money. We were using it for real world transactions. I think crypto, once again, I think we're going to get squeezed so hard this time that crypto is actually going to have to do real world stuff. I don't think we're any longer going to be able to just financialize everything. You look at modern crypto, we have GameFi, we have ArtFi, we have created Fi everything. I think all those things are going to get squeezed. If you're a video game and you have something going on related to your video game that involves anything with the word liquidity in it, if there are liquidity providers of some token you've issued, if there are liquidity pools, you have financialized your video game. And the same financial authorities who've always governed financial stuff are going to come in and squeeze that activity. If you have an NFT project and you've engaged in ArtFi, if you've financialized some fungible token you airdrop to your NFT holders, and there are liquidity pools and liquidity providers, those are financial activities that will probably get squeezed. We're too big now. We're too high profile now. They're not going to let us just continue financializing things to more efficiently extract assets from retail, that whole thing, find new ways of selling them tokens, that whole thing. All that's going to get squeezed this time. I don't know how long it'll take, but eventually they're going to figure out a way to put the squeeze on all that financialization, all the ArtFi, all of the GameFi, all of the DeFi. They're going to put the squeeze on all of that. And crypto in general is going to have to reorient toward real world value, the same types of real world utility and use cases that Cardano has been building toward all this time. The ecosystems that have been overly reliant, laser focused on all this exotic financialization of various other, previously not really financialized activities, they too are going to have to refocus on real world utility. But we've already got a lead. They're going to be behind. Cardano's been working this whole time toward that. Sure, we've been doing a little bit of the DeFi, a little bit of ArtFi, a little bit of GameFi, but it's not the real game we've been getting ready for. We've been getting ready for something else. We've been getting ready for the real world stuff that gets back to the roots of crypto. The crypto that existed when I got into crypto, the crypto that was about real world utility. I think that's the game that comes next. There will still be this weird financialization of stuff that probably should never be financialized. That'll still be going on in some new ways that the regulators haven't figured out how to outlaw yet. But I think the next cycle is going to have to be about real world utility again. We're going to get back to the foundations of crypto. Speaking of Cardano's preparations for what comes next, IOG just put out this little PDF, the essential Cardano guide to the ecosystem. So you can find this on the IOG timeline. They want in order to get this download, they want your email address, but I've always found that they don't really abuse my email address when I give it to IOG. So you give them your email address, and then you can download this PDF. And I think this is the perfect document. If you ever want to explain to your friends why Cardano is the way it is, if you ever want to give somebody a very concise explanation of what Cardano really is, and the things we've been doing to go in this different direction as an ecosystem, this is probably the right document. So it starts out with, kind of an explanation of the three founding entities, and then a really nice timeline that goes all the way from 2015 up till today, explaining exactly what Cardano has been up to. They have this whole why Cardano section. Cardano in numbers. You're probably aware Cardano always looks very good in the form of data about the ecosystem because we're actually focused on the correct things. And then everything else in Cardano that you might want to explain to somebody. There's probably an answer for every question some new person to Cardano would have about the ecosystem. Even if they're a pretty sophisticated crypto person who's been using another ecosystem, find pretty much any information you're looking for, not super technical stuff. They're not explain how the the architecture of the underlying code or anything like that, but there's quite a bit of information here about all kinds of projects and infrastructure inside Cardano. In fact, if you go, they even have a section on content creators in Cardano, and we'll get there in just a second. Oh, here's a great chart on stake pool operators in Cardano. Look at that. We truly are kind of a global community. Sure, heavy concentrations in North America and in Europe, but we're on pretty much all of the populated continents around here. Good info on stake pool operators and even on Cardano content creators. There is this channel right there, Army of Spies. Today was also one of those rare days when a centralized crypto exchange actually cares about ADA. Look at this. Binance.us is putting out a whole guide on Cardano for beginners. They're onboarding the beginners for us with a 7-minute read time article. Probably perfect for beginners because let's face it, no beginner wants to read more than 7 minutes about some blockchain. So I think this is not just random or by chance. I think that Binance knows that the era of Cardano is probably ahead of us and not behind us. Even Charles recently encountered that same information asymmetry about Cardano inside versus outside the community. Here's a post where he says, taking a brief walk into the cryptocurrency Reddit smooth brain section. He's saying they're dumb. I couldn't help but notice the misinformation about Cardano, settlement layer, and computation layer. This is something they've been talking about since the early days of Cardano. Sidechains are effectively the vision of Cardano computation layer made manifest. They can resume eating paint chips now. So this is something that I think a lot of people outside the Cardano ecosystem definitely don't know. This is the whole idea that I've dubbed the Cardano layerverse. That there's going to be a universe of layers making these different trade-offs between the different legs of the blockchain trilemma: decentralization, scaling, and security. You can make whatever balance between those three things you want. You can sacrifice one for the other to extreme degrees if you want and have a sidechain for it. That's all totally possible within Cardano. This is just one of the many things that I think the rest of the crypto ecosystem doesn't realize about Cardano. Ben Goertzel, who's tied to Cardano, of course, through SingularityNet, also had something interesting to say about ChatGPT. He said, ChatGPT is super cool and fun, but it's important to recall OpenAI, who, of course, produces ChatGPT, made basically zero fundamental innovations. Actually, the basic innovation behind the GPT software was made at Google Brain in Mountain View. He's saying those are basically Google innovations. And he goes on and on to give a little bit more background about how all this happened and who he thinks is well positioned to make the next innovations. But the really interesting thing is that he's basically saying ChatGPT is nothing. I think the sort of public reaction to ChatGPT is super interesting, and it's sort of it sort of gives us an idea of how transformative AI is going to be for society. Just watching how people react to things like Midjourney and Dolly and ChatGPT, you can tell already how transformative this is going to be for mainstream society. And what Ben Goertzel is saying here is that basically this is nothing. These innovations were already in place. They're just bringing this to the mainstream for the first time. And he goes on and on in this thread talking about where he thinks the next big innovations might come from. This is really interesting to me because I think ChatGPT, Midjourney, Dolly, these kinds of now publicly accessible AI platforms are amazing. And I can't imagine what the next generation of AI is going to do. I think there are going to be some future dovetails between AI and crypto that we couldn't possibly predict right now. Finally, we couldn't end 2022 without some more delicious scandal related to Gary Gensler and FTX. So this person is going to allege a bunch of ties between Gary Gensler and FTX, specifically people who worked for Gary Gensler at the CFTC. He's now obviously chair of the SEC, but prior to that, he was chair of the CFTC. People who worked with him while he was at CFTC going to work for FTX or having something else to do with them. So he talks about this person who is a CFTC commissioner under Gensler, now on the board of directors for FTX US derivatives. And I assume when he says now, he means sort of pre everything imploding over at FTX. This person, another CFTC commissioner under Gensler, now head of policy and regulatory strategy at FTX subsidiary LedgerX. And I believe this was also, this was another subsidiary, FTX US derivatives, in the case of that prior person. This person, Gary Gensler's CFTC General Counsel, reporting to Gensler. Recruited by Gensler to be SEC General Counsel in 2021, resigned on December 23rd following revelations that he was inappropriately wined and dined by FTX. Again, I'm not making statements of fact here. These are things that are being alleged by this poster here. This person, an attorney at the CFTC under Gensler from 2010 to 2012, promoted by Gary Gensler to legal counsel to Chair Gensler in 2012. Now, general counsel for FTX, multiple unannounced meetings with SEC staff to discuss no action letter to grant FTX a non-compliance loophole. This last one is a senior counselor to Chair Gary Gensler, who, this poster says, continued negotiating with FTX about legal loopholes even after Gensler's, and then he puts this in quotes, 45-minute lecture to tell them no. He says now got huge promotion days after FTX bank run started. So who knows how true these are? I'm sure there was probably, even if there was absolutely nothing going on here, nothing amiss, I'm sure, FTX would be able to hire people away from the CFTC with much higher salaries, during their heyday. So who knows? Could be nothing here, but there do seem to be a lot of connections between Gary Gensler and FTX. I hope you had a great 2022. It's been fun. I think 2023 is going to be a very different year from 2022 for Cardano and crypto in general. I'm hoping 2024, like the second half of it, and 2025 will be much better years for all of crypto. I hope you have a great new year, and I'll talk to you soon.